So it's a huge pleasure for me to welcome our distinguished guest this evening. On behalf of the Program Committee and all our History of Science Society members assembled here, I want to say how very honored we are to Sverker Sorlin that you agreed to deliver the Society's distinguished lecture for 2017. Professor Sverker Sorlin is Professor of Environmental History at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm and a co-founder of the Environmental Humanities Lab, or Laboratory, which is an initiative of the Division of History of Science, Technology and the Environment, which is also at the RIT in Stockholm. He's one of the most, and I actually would say the most, influential commentator in Scandinavia on environmental policy and climate change, and a leading participant in what he is calling, and what we will call in conjunction with him, the environmental turn in the humanities and the social sciences. He's probably best known to us as a pioneer in drawing attention to the historiography of the Arctic and for his scholarship on the geophysical field sciences, especially glaciology, environmental sustainability, politics, and governance. And I'm longing for him to explain the image that we have shown here at some points. Sverker is an acclaimed public intellectual in Scandinavia, a critic and writer of literary nonfiction and essays. His most recent book was on the Anthropocene, and he's won many prestigious prizes, including the August Strindberg Prize for his 2-volume History of European Science and Ideas, 1492 to 1918. That's a heck of a stretch to cover. And he's held visiting positions in Berkeley, Cambridge, UK, Princeton, Cape Town, Oslo, and the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And he's currently director of a Center of Excellence. It's called a Nordforsk Center of Excellence for Resource Extraction and Sustainable Arctic Communities, which he leads with 15 partner institutions drawn from the universities, museums, and other institutes from 7 countries. His work, to those who invited him, and I do urge you to address it if you don't already know it, his work is truly compelling, including studies on the emergence of environmental prediction, the strategic and technological value of the circumpolar north, the impact of the International Polar Year in 2007, and post-colonial pressures on indigenous communities, all of which, and more, are reflected in the many advisory boards and special projects that he leads or participates in. He's had a long-term interest in the formation, the both historical and present-day formation of environmental expertise. How people come to believe that there is expertise, which we know is an issue today, or what could be called the roles and functions of knowledge in environmentally informed modern societies. And he also serves as a policy analyst and advisor to government. So that's astonishing, and we are deeply impressed by what you have to think. And I just want to mention to our audience, among Sverker's books, particularly on northern themes, there's Narrating the Arctic, there are a book called Northscapes, and Science, Geopolitics and Culture in the Polar Region. He's recently working on a project that tracks how Arctic climate change travels through media and politics. So we could have no better guide to the troubling themes of climate change and the geopolitics of the circumpolar north than our distinguished lecturer tonight. When we first corresponded about the invitation, I promised him an audience deeply appreciative of environmental matters. So don't let me down. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Sverker Sorlin to deliver the 2017 History of Science Society Distinguished Lecture, Greening the Great White, Encounters of Knowledge and Environment, and the Northern Turn in the History of Science. Please, Sverker.
Well, thank you very much. I will have to say a few words myself as well after this long introduction. Some of the things you mentioned I'd almost forgotten. The image, I promised to say a couple of words about that. Actually, I use it often as a kind of an icon for our division at the Royal Institute in Stockholm, because it's so unexpected for historians to work in the field, and also in this particular kind of field, which is actually Naples, where we have some studies of waste management. There's lots of garbage there, and there's lots of mafia, and it's not me in the uniform, I can tell you. Dear fellow historians, over the last couple of years I felt more and more as if my work on history has turned into a kind of defense work, a protection of virtues and principles, as if I realized I held a kind of secret, like the members of that lonely crowd in Fahrenheit 451 who gather among the trees to mumble texts they learned by heart, because all the books they owned and kept and loved were burnt. I think not so much about single facts or news that have been faked, although that is disheartening enough. I'm talking about the deeper undermining of reason and sheer decency that is ongoing and sadly linked to power. That is, I believe, why our work is, if possible, even more important now than it was ever before. I need to say no more. You know already what I'm thinking about. The question is, how can we take that mission on? How could we do more without compromising what we already do and have learned to do well? And that is why, really, I would like to move north for this talk, because I think there is something that we can see perhaps more clearly there. But let me, before we move, just add that on a similar occasion as this one, back in 2010 at the American Society for Environmental History meeting in Portland, Oregon that year, the dinner speech was given by the respected cartoonist Jack Oman of the Oregonian, later a Pulitzer Prize winner with a Sacramento Bee. This is one of his images. He told us that half of his colleagues across the US had lost their jobs, and that many newspapers were closing down. Still, he managed to crack some jokes, very sourly, but they were very good. A public sphere without cartoonists means that citizens have lost one of their sensory tools with which they make sense of their time and place. Back home, I wrote a very sad column about it in my own paper, the Stockholm Daily Dagens Nyheter. Still, I couldn't have dreamed of what the public sphere would become in just 7 years. In distinction from cartoonists, most of us still have jobs, although we are under hard pressure in many countries and by the US Congress whenever they discuss budgets to the NSF and NEH. And in many ways, I think we have to start seeing ourselves also as cartoonists, as belonging in the community of friction makers and sense makers. My take on the ongoing northern turn in the humanities is that the North is a good place to address questions of fundamental importance. And I mean both for the world we live in and for the writing of history. Some of the largest issues today are to do with scales and agency. We share the value that history should be loyal to agency of people, but we can also see how history increasingly plays out at scales and with ramifications that move far beyond our ordinary archival bandwidth of observation. There is a nervousness around these issues. Debates are raging, manifestos written and rebutted. The northern turn happens, I think, because as if by a subterranean impulse, we have realized that things are visible in the north that could help us sort these issues, and not just there, but anywhere on the globe. And we also sense that in our time, we really should have something to say about the large issues. Cognitive science is mapping the brain in super projects. Resilience science is taking on global sustainability. Economists are, I hope, finally starting their inevitable breakup from the neoclassical paradigm. Along with our pointillist care for patterns of detail, we should, as historians, also respond to the hunger and thirst for meaningful narratives that could assist our troubled navigation. So the northern turn reflects, I believe, a much deeper longing in our profession to do more. Greening that the Great White may seem an awkwardly ambiguous and strange title, though. Green is good, of course, but is it good if the white goes away, as we know is what happens? Ice and snow are melting, but it's also true that environmental protection has never been more active. Enormous areas of land are turned into reserves. Here is a map of the situation in Svalbard and Greenland, and particularly the Svalbard image speaks miles, I think. The situation in Russia is similar, down on the right-hand side. It's not a very good map, though, where among the 101 nature reserves, or zapovedniks, several in the north have been created in the last 25 years. Among those, the Great Arctic Reserve in the Krasnoyarsk region, according to Russian sources, the largest reserve of Russia and Eurasia, as well as one of the largest in the world, covering 42,000 square kilometers, the size of the Kingdom of Denmark. Alaska, too, has massive reserves next door to the North Slope oil fields. Canada, same thing, and not on the map, though, but in my own Sweden, by far the largest parks and reserves are in the north. In fact, a research project in my own department at KTH is entitled The Greening of the Poles, led by Peter Roberts, our colleague. So, as you hear, like so many good things, my title is stolen. It's also stolen from a Canadian volume, Rethinking the Great White North. Its subtitle contains the words race and whiteness. It links science with color in an interesting way. In one of the chapters, Stephen Bocking argues that whiteness, and I quote, maintains an analogical relationship with science, end of quote. He talks of, and I quote again, a neglect of the specific contexts of racialization, including scientific institutions and disciplines, end quote. And he says this after a careful analysis of both nature conservation and anthropology and other fields. Catriona Sandilands in the same volume studies the ecologization of national parks and observes what she calls an erasure of human presence from these areas. So greening can be just another version of whitening of nature, an imprint of the scientific southern culture on the north and its populations. So by this act of linking to color and environment in my title, I wanted to say something that I believe is central to the ongoing northern turn in the history of science and related fields. And I will give you some evidence of this turn in a moment. Namely, that it is also an act of reinterpretation of the kind of work that science does in the north and elsewhere. Science is no longer that beacon of truth and technology advancing in what explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson once called the northward course of empire, a volume from 1922. In an unforgettable moment of climate determinism, where even civilization whitened and elevated as it pressed on toward lower mean temperatures. And as you may note, on the top end of that curve, we find his own native Winnipeg, of course, as the epitome of the human enterprise on Earth. This curve is so very cool, I never give a talk without it, I can tell you. The northern curves today are very different, reminding us rather of our various sins and shortcomings. Foreboding in their icy imprints what Torontonian Jane Jacobs, in the title of her last book in 2004, prophetically called the dark age ahead. Arctic sea routes are quite simply less utopian now than they were in Stephenson's days. Now, a story that highlights how ice, precisely, made it to the era of our current anxieties flared up in American and world media in the spring of 2016. It was sparked off by an article in the top-rated journal Progress in Historical Geography on feminist glaciology by a group of historians at the University of Oregon. And I would like to remind you that I am not a spokesperson of Oregon. It just happens to pop up the second time in my talk here. And even in Sweden, as they say in this country, an otherwise widely respected, actually not in this country, I meant the United States, but it's so easy to be a little bit confused when you travel far. So I start again. Even in Sweden, an otherwise widely respected columnist and author repeated the climate denialist slander about this piece and what the twittering right conceived as NSF's senseless funding of it. What triggered her, this columnist, I think was the rendering of ice, the most universal substance of all, water, in its most elevated places, in high mountains and at the poles, that this element of sheer purity had politics. Ice is physics, free of opinion. And I think her position, she didn't know about these things, I'm sure, but still, her position confirms Stephen Bocking's analysis that we just heard. Glaciology must remain white. And in crafting a response to her in the Dagens Nyheter, I read a book by the Argentinian political scientist Jorge Daniel Tajan. You see it here, Glaciers, the Politics of Ice, from 2015, based on his UC Berkeley PhD. The company Barrick Golds wanted to mine in the Andes and use dynamite and soot for melting to clear off the glaciers that hindered them from reaching the treasures below, the gold. The issue was brought to the Argentinian parliament, and a law, actually, to protect the glaciers was indeed passed in 2010. And in fact, a similar law existed already in France, the Loi de Montagne from 1985, and in Italy, glaciers are a commons under the water legislation since 1921. Now, as Mark Carey, the leader of the Oregon team, and others have demonstrated in their research on the Andes, on Himalaya, and other regions, freshwater supplies from glaciers are important for small mountain communities, but also for big things like watering of rivers across the northern Indian subcontinent. Much of the work to take care of water for drinking, washing, household animals is carried out precisely by women. Needless to say, this hated piece became the most read and cited article in Progress of Human Geography last year. What is noteworthy in this story is how quickly a seemingly small subject, the study of glaciers, turned into a prairie fire of argument on climate change, gender and power relations, the use and abuse of science and science funding, post-colonial legacies, and of course, the future of the planet. And that last thing said without irony. The critics were simply terribly uninformed of the ways glaciology has changed. It is now so much more. Here, striding up the hill, is Ninnis Rosqvist, a Stockholm University geographer and leader of the Tarfala Research Station, which holds the world's longest record of glacial data from 1946, 1 year older than that of Juneau Ice Shield in Alaska. The photographic documentation of the glacial retreat in this region goes back to 1910 and is now part of a completely instrumented glacier. And these pictures of long-term environmental change are, I think, the cryosphere versions of Keeling's Mauna Loa record of atmospheric CO2, the iconic curve that you saw a moment ago. And one day, Ninis said to herself, "Isn't it strange that we have collected all these data over all these years and never thought of what it might mean to the people who live here?" So she engaged and involved the local Sami in the region in data collection and in actually setting the research agenda. I happen to know this because we work fairly closely together, Ninis and I, over several years. And she's now a national celebrity on TV with her work and cited in the news media, and wins prizes for her innovative research. On the other hand, the Sami were always partners since the 1940s, when they started working for the station then in construction, as builders and maintenance workers in many dimensions. And even earlier, they served as mountain guides to scientists in the tradition of loyal and trustworthy field assistants that Jane Camerini brought out so well in her Osiris paper in the 90s on Wallis and Ali in the Malay archipelago. I explore this subject in my own work with further examples from glaciology in Greenland and Iceland, where the founder of the Tarfala station, Stockholm geographer Hans Ahlman, very skillfully collaborated with local residents in Greenland and in Iceland. I have a couple examples here from Iceland. So early climate change knowledge was co-produced in the field by Sami, Inuit, and Icelanders. Hans Ahlman was one of the major players of glaciology in the first half of the 20th century. He even had his own very special theory of global warming, which he called polar warming. He thought climate change happened, but only at the poles, and for reasons he couldn't really explain, but he wanted to research further through careful measurements of the retreat of glacial circumpolar areas, and in Antarctica, for which he organized a famous Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition, the NBSX, in 1949 to 1952. It included participants from South Africa and the United States, and has proven by later research to be a far more political undertaking, actually, than its own self-portrayal suggested. Ahlman turned out to be a political animal himself, finishing his career as the Swedish ambassador to Oslo after having demonstrated his capabilities as a science diplomat in bringing no less than 2 exiled Scandinavian scientists back from the US, where they had played seminal roles during the war years. Harald Ulrich Sverdrup, who headed Scripps Institution of Oceanography for more than a decade, finally gave in to his friend's wooing and returned to set up the Norwegian Polar Institute in 1948 under Halvard Lange as foreign minister, who incidentally had served as an assistant during Ahlman's work on Norwegian glaciers a couple of decades earlier. And on the small image, you can see that where Sverdrup is trying to catch up with his Swedish friend Ahlman during fieldwork in Svalbard on skis. It's an unusual situation. Usually the Norwegians are ahead. The year before, in 1947, Carl Gustav Rossby was persuaded by Ahlman to leave the Institute of Meteorology at the University of Chicago to set up shop in Stockholm, while maintaining close ties with Chicago, Woods Hole, and the Princeton Computer Project. This may seem a side story, most of which is well covered already by Christine Harper, Paul Edwards, and Jim Fleming. But it may be added, I think, that under Rossby, Stockholm quickly rose to global significance in what would soon turn into computer-based climate change science with very strong bearings on the North. The Scandinavians got interested in the CO2 hypothesis, and Rossby, tireless broker and man of ideas, made his collaborators organize an early Scandinavian CO2 measurement network while at the same time they also beat the Americans in producing the first numerical weather predictions in 1955 with a computer built well at KTH in Stockholm, my own institution. Leader on the workshop floor of these exercises was Rossby's graduate student, Bert Bolin, who 30 years later would become the founding president of the IPCC, probably known to many of you here. And during their years together in the 50s, Rossby and Bolin served as president and secretary, respectively, of the Swedish Committee for the International Geophysical Year, with very much activities in near the poles in 1957-58. This Stockholm lineage goes deep. When Rossby left Stockholm for the US Weather Bureau in 1924, he was simply fed up with his counterpart in Stockholm. He did so with a letter from this man, Svante Arrhenius, who in 1896 had made the first calculation of global warming through atmospheric CO2. Not because he believed in any human forcing of climate for at least hundreds of years, but because he was interested in how ice ages could form. And at the tail end of the same lineage, we find another Nobel laureate, Paul Crutzen, who in 1958 came with his young wife from the Netherlands to the small Swedish city of Gävle. I fear you haven't heard of Gävle, but it's a very small city, because he'd found a job there as a construction engineer. He was building bridges. But he had barely arrived in Gävle when he saw an ad for a job as a programmer at Stockholm University. He applied and he got hired. His supervisor turned out to be Bert Bolin, and Crutzen somehow couldn't help getting interested in atmospheric problems, like ozone, and ended up winning the prize in chemistry, a subject he had no degree in. And the reason this rambling Stockholm tale actually is not a side story is that Crutzen is now credited with the invention of the concept of the Anthropocene, a word I assume that you have heard. And a word that is central, actually, for me in my reading of the Northern Turn. Only that it wasn't just Crutzen's invention. When historians started to learn about this new concept, which was very early indeed, in fact, John McNeill at Georgetown University was co-authoring articles with Crutzen and other Earth system scientists more than a decade ago. So when this was known, we did what historians usually do. We historicized it, as Clarence Glacken, the Berkeley geographer, had started doing already in the 1950s. And the outcome of that work, I may say, was that many, very many, had talked about an era of human hegemonic agency on the planetary scale for a long time. But perhaps more importantly than finding the roots of the concept, we also found that there was another way of telling the history of science, informed by this concept, since, say, the days of Lyell. Names and theories, ideas and elements like ice and snow, and places like the Arctic that had been at the margin of our trusted canon were now moving closer to center stage. Allman, for sure, is among those. Sea ice measuring Russian oceanographers, such as Zubov and Knipovich, or indeed of Vladimir Vernadsky with his biosphere concept, or a guy, Stuart Callender, the British steam engineer who ventured in 1938 to propose human burning of fossil fuels as the chief driver of a global warming, now considered a landmark article, but who was written off for many years as an amateur. Actually, Allman called him so himself. Backed by no institution or academic prestige, Callender had worked on spare time using fragile data. Now, under the surface, a new storyline has been forming that we can now see more clearly. And all through, it had this very special relation to the north, to ice, to the great white, and at least potentially to the greening of it, which is the moment to now return to this image that we saw before, and the man in the middle with a little beard. His name is Antoni Dobrowolski. Nothing in his timid en face reveals it, but he was a passionate Polish nationalist with a lifelong love affair with ice and snow. That's why he's in this picture. He had been jailed and sent to Caucasus for his rebellious politics, joined later the Belgian De Gerlach expedition to Antarctica in the last couple of years of the 1800s, and loved every minute of the dark and the cold when he could do pioneering work on crystallography, ice crystallography. He fled his country again during the First World War to Stockholm, actually, where he worked away on his major 900-page tome, The Natural History of Ice, published in Polish, in which he launched the concept cryosphere, from the Greek cryos, cold, and that was in 1923. In the following years, Dobrowolski, just like Callender, encountered the solidifying Anglo-Scandinavian establishment of glaciology, which I must say was not very interested in his new concept. Later, in the first issue of the new Journal of Glaciology after the war in 1947, Gerald Seligman, famous for his 1936 book, Snow Structures and Ski Fields, said of his Polish colleague that his work was commendable, but that cryosphere had been a no-starter. Glaciologists didn't cry, or at least they didn't want to have a word that made them think about it. Allman, otherwise an anxious person in the field, we have many evidence of that, took the same position, no cryosphere, no cry. It took until the satellites came up in the early 1970s for cryosphere to make it and do a decisive breakthrough when the white could be visualized from above and proved to be really, really grand, a quarter of the northern hemisphere in January. So some big words here: biosphere, cryosphere, Anthropocene, can be stitched together into a story of ice and snow and environmental change that connect a number of points to some of the most major concerns of our time. And we do well to keep them alive when we approach the past. So as you can hear, I'm blasphemous enough to argue that we should indeed allow ourselves to engage history backwards sometimes. We should use the anxieties and the wraths, our righteous effect, in the moment of disaster to return to the history we thought we knew and revisit it and always find a new history there that has a reason to be told. Boundaries is yet another important word on that level and a category in its own right, used in a quasi-Malthusian fashion in the Limits to Growth report in 1972 and returning forcefully, but with a totally different logic, in the 2009 Nature article on planetary boundaries. The illustration is from that piece. I was actually one of the 29 co-authors. Most of the others were Earth system scientists. It was a very special experience indeed, not least the 24 hours of its making the news around the world in September 2009. I happened to be in Santa Barbara that day with several other of the authors for a meeting. And I, as the others, made various statements over the email, and all of a sudden I saw my name popping up on the screen in Mother Jones, that magazine I always admired. It was literally only minutes after I'd said these words on my type keypad that it was out there, without knowing that I would. And it was also terrifying experience of the forces that are at play in the globalization of science communication. So mixed feelings. But my point is that this Earth system science way of translating planetary data into a set of boundaries, in this case, for ozone, ocean acidification, biodiversity, atmospheric CO2, 9 in total, that this act is also a technology, an environing technology, producing the environment as a social and historical category in a process that has been ongoing throughout the period of modern environment. And I'm just now theorizing this concept, environing technologies, in work I do with my close colleague Nina Worms back in Stockholm. Anyway, my story here has a background from a forthcoming book with Johns Hopkins University Press co-authored with two close colleagues, Paul Ward in Cambridge and Libby Robin at ANU. It is actually a conceptual history of the environment itself, an old word, very old word, whose meaning changed after the Second World War, an event, I think, of very great significance. And our symbolic year of choice for that transition was 1948, the year of two rallying outcries using the concept in the modern sense by ecologist William Vogt and conservationist Fairfield Osborne. It was also the year of peak oil, presented here graphically in an apocalyptic book by physicist Harrison Brown a few years later. It was also the year of Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, and if you read the book, you can go on and find more evidence for 1948. I stop here. We found that the concept of environment was doing a fabulous work of integration across a range of science fields, making connections between people as different as Jevons, Lotka, Vernadsky, Dobrowolski, that I just mentioned, Wiener, Julian Huxley, and some also of the Arctic scientists. We had, in fact, collected much of the evidence in a previous volume of Sources, with Yale providing what we call the genealogy of our current Earth system science. But it's equally important to see how much of this integrated work on the environment was carried out not in the lab or not in the field, but in a growing number of conferences and in diplomatic contexts. It was negotiated, it was talked about, it was talked into being. Chief of those became much later the UN Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972. But long before that, prepared in 1948, the UNESCO meetings at Lake Success had proven an early arena for the concept crafting, which gathered the right people at the right time. Other key meetings followed in Princeton in 1955, assembling again many of the big names in the geosciences like Carl Sauer, Charles Thornthwaite, but also Lewis Mumford, of course, who was everywhere. More meetings were held as the environment grew as an issue of importance in the United States, with a report to the president in 1965, already featuring climate change as a serious issue. Now, from so simple a beginning, became communities of knowledge that gathered around this concept as one that made a work for them that they could use, both internally in their sciences and externally in working with the non-academic world of policy and solutions. So environment was an extremely useful concept. Above all, in this work, I think we understood much better why environment became arguably one of the key concepts of the previous century, up there with democracy and economic growth. And again, no irony at all. And this is when we can return again to the greening and the white. It is an important dimension of the environment in the 1950s that it was very much used by the US military. I've learned from some of my American colleagues over the years, Ron Dole, Jay Camblin, that the environment was also the three-dimensional space of warfare, as in this 1946 Time magazine illustration. In addition, environment was also the immediate sphere of action surrounding the soldier or the pilot. I'm among those lucky ones who have spent time in the archives of the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory. The collections over the period 1927 through 1947. The lab was dismantled in 47 just as the conceptual shift that I mentioned occurred. It was still about environment shaping man, the soldier, not the other way around. But when the environment expanded to be everything from the sea floor to the stratosphere, it became something else. And the terraforming or cryoforming of the Arctic started taking place. The US military built the Thule Station in northwestern Greenland with Camp Sentry in the ice sheet nearby. A book that is just out by Henry Nielsen and Christian Huitfeldt at Aarhus University, Denmark, explores the full detail of the bizarre world of snow and ice engineering. At the same time, it can't be separated from the multinational work on ice core drilling. At the Tarfala station in Sweden that I mentioned before, there was no planning for a third world war. But Atlas Copco, the Swedish technology giant, drilled a hole into the glacier, purely for research purposes, of course. Only at the Kiruna Geophysical Observatory nearby were high politics allowed to enter, with the US military paying almost half of their budget for Sputnik observations and the monitoring of Soviet nukes testing in the special kind of distributed research strategy that John Kriege elucidated in his 2006 book on American hegemony and the post-war reconstruction of science in Europe. Actually, a clear-cut example of that happening there in the Swedish north. Tarfala had another politics. They had climate politics. An anthropogenic climate change, as anthropogenic climate change became the scientific norm from the 1970s, the Tarfala community of scientists worked still steadfastly on their natural variability hypothesis in the spirit of Ullmann, who remained largely on the same position when he died in 1974 as when he rejected Callendar several decades earlier, or as Robert Millikan when he wrote in his 1930s book, Alleged Sins of Science, that we mere humans shouldn't be anxious, but, and I quote him, sleep in peace with the consciousness that the Creator has put some foolproof elements into his handiwork and that man is powerless to do it any titanic physical damage. Here with the Alberta tar sands in the background, just to illustrate why we can't agree with Millikan today. For the people who once lived at Thule and in northwest Greenland and were forcefully moved by the Americans to Qaanaaq, some 30 miles further north, it was especially hard to agree with Millikan, if they ever thought about that. Their community of 700 in the northernmost human settlement in the world has been studied carefully by Danish anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup over many years. Hastrup's work has nothing nostalgic to it. It is a very modernist story of how people keep adapting to change and how they are as connected to the World Wide Web here as anywhere else, and they share the same concerns as all the rest of us. But it is also a story of how much more cumbersome life has become because of climate change. On the Edge of Time, as she calls it, also the title of that marvelous book you see on the right-hand side, of uncertainty and danger on weaker and more erratic ices, with shorter hunting seasons, less travel, which means less conviviality, a less friendly Arctic to live in. During my years as president of the Swedish Committee for the 4th International Polar Year a decade ago, indeed mimicking the mission of Rossby and Bolin a half-century earlier, a spooky thing for a historian, I can tell you, I got the opportunity to get deeper into the full range of research going on in what had always been the white and pure, but was now increasingly becoming dirty and impacted as by new mines and prospecting for oil and gas. I was impressed during those years to learn how much good and important work that was carried out by Arctic humanities and social science scholars, who in fact made up a third of the entire research effort during IPY, compared to 0% in the IGY 50 years earlier. That was a pure science undertaking. Historians were also around in the IPY, piling up an ever larger body of work that has kept growing since, multiplying the previous singular contributions by Trevor Levere and a very small handful of other Arctic historians before the 2000s. But now this has changed rapidly. The issue agenda of the Northern Turn has helped catalyze new research practices among historians as well. I think of myself and my closest collaborators over the last decade not as odd and exceptional, as we sometimes go to the field, but rather as templates of responsible scholars in this era of hopeful sadness and necessary defense work. But disturbingly, climate change is not only an impetus for people like ourselves, but also to the forces that wanted to increase resource exploitation. Trump is now reopening the fossil fuel extraction in Alaska that Obama reduced. Putin certainly never even reduced them. Little Norway doesn't seem very keen to let fossil fuels stay underground in the Arctic. And only God knows the mind of Justin Trudeau. At times, he doesn't seem to know himself, I think. But I still give him the benefit of the doubt. A true interdisciplinary teacher, geographer, engineer, fighter, a Da Vinci kind of CV. Maybe also left-handed, I don't know. That is also why I am suspicious of the greening. That is mostly about nature reserves, created as boundary zones to protect the extraction. And one of my main preoccupations right now, as you heard, is a major center of excellence on extractive industries and sustainable Arctic communities, RECSAC. Greening is a politics of nature and resources. Science does tremendous work in the Arctic, but also is serving roles in what we may call greenwashing. A bit like Canada, the country that had too much geography in Premier Mackenzie King's famous statement to the British Parliament in 1936, we can say about the entire Arctic region that it still has too little history, and that I mean as written history, certainly no less in other respects. I got an immediate sense of the problem as I was recently asked to write the Arctic Oceans chapter for the Cambridge Oceanic Histories that is just about to appear. I accepted, assuming there wasn't much to say, but precisely that proved to be the towering challenge. To write about this vast, great white and its human relations, 4 million inhabitants, 5% of the globe, how could it be done, and why is it now being done with such newfound energy? My answer to this question is about agency, an extraordinary agency that must be increasingly recognized as historical, but also about traditional agency. And let me spend my remaining minutes on agency and how the Northern Turn is helping us re-articulate it in our time. Agency was always an issue, certainly, with so few inhabitants in this vast space. So when we stopped doing Arctic science history as one goddamn expedition after the other, we looked for other manifestations of agency on the ground, typically of the presence of state and science, nature reserves, settlements, infrastructures, encounters with indigenous knowledge, and performative installations, or actants, if you want to use that word, such as precisely research stations, or just scattered surveyors. This work has built, let's admit that, a powerful narrative and makes science itself an actor, often serving the national interest, and it proved significant as a research line that some of us pursued for a good couple of decades, linking science to the wider history of geopolitics. These two publications that I just showed you here, this book here and this fairly recent article here, from 2002 and 2014, are results of that still productive line of Northern history. But it is already, I think, being superseded now by trajectories of new work addressing agency in new ways. And this is partly about perspective, seeing in the relatively small Arctic region the fate, in a sense, of the entire world, linking agencies inside the region with those elsewhere. Some work does that, and I here again show you a number of recent books that deal with these issues. Hastrup's work I already mentioned, Julie Cruikshank's on cultural encounters around glaciers in the 18th century Pacific Northwest, Sheila Grant's work in Canada on forced relocations and issues of justice, Lisa Piper's on the use of science by mining companies to evade nature protection in subarctic Canada, Paul Josephson's work on Russian Arctic science, to mention a few. Or Andrew Stools on the deconstruction of the superficial so-called New Arctic narratives, published only last year. These books, I think, together speak to cultural, social, and environmental issues anywhere, although they focus on the Arctic. Now let me return to Stuhl's Unfreezing the Arctic, which says it in the very title. Arctic history used to be exceptionalist, of a frozen place, where, as it were, things happen differently or not at all, when in fact they do happen, always happen. They're at the bottom the same history as everywhere else, with lots of human agency, in fur trading, in reindeer herding, in military planning. These are stories we are familiar with from wherever cultural encounters take place. So Stuhl's work, I think, is an imaginative amalgamation of histories of politics, authority, indigenous knowledge, science, environment on the Canada-Alaska border. It's also about method, about ethics. His is an intimate history based also on being there, listening. An informant tells him, and I quote, "Don't bring back a hollow story," end quote. And Stuhl takes this to heart. You should bring something back that is of use to the community. Now, if Stuhl is on the right track here, and he surely is, how could we then explain the Northern turn? If what we need is to de-exceptionalize the North and write, in a sense, a normal history of agency and power, is the new history of the new North just a fad? That he argues. Not quite, I think. While I very much agree with Andy's public history position, I think we have to separate the methodological response, what Stuhl calls a transnational environmental history of science, which is spot on. We must separate that from the reasons for the Northern turn that I believe are even wider and deeper and even more thrilling. And we must consider both, I think, and do more. So let me here invoke the word Weltanschauung, and for a third time this evening, without irony. Because I would argue what really makes it possible to conceive of a Northern turn is a historiography that will take us further in our ambitions of scaling and connecting different kinds of histories. And to identify in this work of a human agency of our time and day that also appears on other levels, adding to but not reducing the, so to speak, ordinary agencies that Stuhl rightly talks about. And we may call these extraordinary agencies, agencies that we have as a global collective, however divided. These agencies are visible on geological scales. Perhaps this is why so many people visit Iceland these days. After the financial meltdown and the arrival of the Anthropocene, Icelandic tourism is up 400% in a decade. It's an enigma, like a new religion. The president of Iceland is our colleague. He's an historian, and he's concerned. He gave a talk in Leeds recently that I heard when he presented himself as roaming the slopes of his volcanoes, asking the tourists worried questions and observing in despair endless queues to undersized field toilets. When someone asked him who he was, he replied, "I'm the president of this country." Yeah, it was quite as funny in Leeds, I must tell you. Iceland's allure is about geopower, the geopower of humanity. Hence this pilgrimage, I think, this is my theory of Icelandic tourism that you get, this pilgrimage to this small country of deep time. It's a small country of deep time, of a Jules Verne world of connections. I may be wrong, of course, but Iceland seems to offer this strange sense of belonging to an emerging geo-humanity. One may think of Laxness' novel, Christianity Under the Glacier. If you didn't read it, do. Miracles come and go, like disasters, like streetcars almost in Iceland. But our interpretive schemes are changing. It's no longer Christianity under the glacier. There is something else. There may be something about new mega-narratives locating human agency even in the geo-stories. And we see that very clearly, I think, in the Arctic. Without these narratives, no northern turn. They are now becoming part of what we call history, actually. To invoke John Donne, no history is an island. They are part of the main. And even some of the very big issues that we didn't deal with before, we are now dealing with as history. These narratives are making the planet graspable, as with Sabine Höhler's masterful analysis of Spaceship Earth and Biosphere 2, published a couple of years ago. This is more than globalization. It is the stitching together of the separate spheres, the geosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the cryosphere, into this limited planet. And that's why you need these concepts from the 20th century, largely. Joe Masco, the Chicago anthropologist, talked about it as the age of fallout, here depicted in an early presentation of the spread of radionuclides from the Mike and Bravo tests. Planet is becoming graspable. To the right is a rendering of the so-called teleconnections of only last year, the super Earth systems that we humans now affect, connecting the poles and the monsoons. At least if we are to believe the Earth system scientists. I have no personal opinion on this. I just read scientific journals. So this is Anthropocene iconography. It spans our current age. It has become terribly visible in the Arctic. It is the subterranean impulse again, and this time we feel it in the humanities. This is extraordinary agency, human intentionality on the species scale, making its impact on the planetary so far without a functional politics, instead producing madmen and fear. So this is the history that lies in stock, waiting for us to theorize and research as we pursue our northern turn. And good for us. There were always scientists around in all possible roles in these processes, as protagonists, but also as the storytellers, where the Earth system science community is among the most perceptive these days. So I will end this talk on one of my favorite ideas, bad pedagogy. I should, of course, have started with it. But it's basically about the various modes and arenas of narration, or genres, if you like, where this new Weltanschauung is taking place. I don't have time for a full investigation here, but let me just allude to a few things. It's big science, storytelling, in popular culture, for example, films, movies, inconvenient truths. It's big history, David Christian style. It's new mega projects linking archaeology and climate science, like IHOPE, the acronym. It's a new human Earth history emerging, and it's part of our job to engage in writing it, not necessarily, or not even primarily, by doing the job of the Earth science storytellers. They do their job very well themselves on their own, but by understanding what they are up to, how they pursue their groundbreaking project. And this shouldn't be new to us. We belong there. Not least because historians of science will always, in a sense, provide the ultimate scaling, which is telling the story of how all these components work together, forming the new Weltanschauung, like Sarton and Corre and others did before us. But we will, of course, do it differently. We can no longer just look from the outside on the rotating spheres. The agency I'm talking about is acting now. Its impacts are imminent. We are responsible. We are vulnerable together, which I think is why we aspire to do more. Thank you.